That's a different class. And while we're waiting, just out of curiosity, how many people have had other classes today? Is this your first class today? Has anybody else had any others, like any morning classes?
One.
You had one today?
Yeah, it was all online though.
Oh, okay. Anybody else have a live class today? No?
I
Okay.
had mine, but I was with you.
Oh, yeah. So you'll hear 80% of the same speech again. So this course is until 3. I sort of suspect that today we might get it out a little bit early, maybe 10 minutes early, not much, but I try not to go over too much course material the first class because just to kind of give you a sense of what the course is about, but a lot of times we get people who register late, like during ad drop week, and so they might miss the first week. So I try not to do anything critical, but I don't want it to be a wasted class. So we do some programming just to give you a sense of what the course is about, but a lot of times what happens is that the first and second week are kind of duplicate. Not quite duplicate, but we definitely go over more material the second week, but you get the idea. Test. Okay. I recorded 2 other classes today and I didn't get a chance to actually check the streams, so I hope it's actually doing the audio correctly. We'll find out. Okay, I guess we can go ahead and get started. So everyone can see okay, and I'm just going to turn the lights down just a little bit so you can see up here. I don't want to make it so dark you can't actually see. Is that a good middle ground for everyone? You can see up there, but you can still see your keyboard and stuff? Okay.
Oh, and Chris, if you could have everybody just shut their machines down at the end of class, that way when I go through and wipe down the keyboards and stuff after you guys leave.
Perfect. Okay. If I forget, you guys got to remind me.
You can't, because I got you can stay. That's fine. Sounds good.
Okay, everyone can see up here? Everyone in the back can hear me okay? And it's going to be kind of tough with the mask situation. Okay, so it sounded like most people in here haven't had me before. So my name is Dr. Bakley. And in reality, a lot of people are going to forget how to pronounce that midway through the semester. I won't be offended. So it's Bakley, the word bake and Lee. But people forget. So some people started calling me Dr. B a couple of semesters ago, and that sort of stuck, but you can just call me professor if you forget. That's fine. I don't get too offended at this point in my life about a lot of things. So this is intro to programming. First of all, everyone's in the correct room, right? Okay. So I do have an office phone, but I always tell people by far the easiest way to get a hold of me is just going to be by email. The reason being is because, I do teach a lot of live classes, and even, during the pandemic, I'm teaching a lot live. And just the chances of you happening to catch me in my office during that time is kind of low. So see if I can adjust this. I have to make some mask adjustments this weekend here. Okay. But by far the best way to get a hold of me is email, because, I just always have my email open. People are, whether it's students or other faculty or other projects I'm working on, I'm just always getting emails. So I'm just used to having that open off to the side, and usually that's where you'll get your quickest answer. Everyone can get into the river mail, correct? Knows how to get to that. Now, officially, the school policy is that you're supposed to do everything through river mail. If it's just a quick question about an assignment, I'll usually kind of as long as there's no personal information, I'll usually answer it. But if there's any sort of personal information about your situation in particular, I can't answer it over your personal email. Does that make sense? So if you had a question that really doesn't matter who knows the answer to, like if you're like, hey, on assignment number 3, this sentence is a little unclear. Can you restate that? I'm not going to make a big deal about it. I'll just restate it for you. But if it's like, hey, I'm kind of unclear on my current grade. Can you help me tally my grade up? Obviously, I can't do that over your personal email. So officially, it's try to do as much as possible through Rivermail. Yeah, because again, I can't talk about any information specific to a student over your personal email. So this is a programming class. I realize a lot of this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense just now. We'll go over it. Let's go over the parts you care about. So the book. So I understand it's very expensive being a student these days. We're actually relatively lucky in Florida that our tuition isn't that high. I think even when, many years ago when I was a student, because I went to school here in Florida, I don't think the tuition was that much different than what it is now. We've been able to hold it pretty steady. Some other states you hear about these students with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of loans and stuff. I think that'd be pretty difficult to do at IRSC. So, however, the books have gone through the roof. I had a course this morning. The official bookstore price was $200. Somebody told me that in another class they had a book that was $300. Has anybody looked at the official price for this book, for this course, from the bookstore?
It's $185.
Yeah. And you're talking that at that point it's half the cost of the course is the book price. And to me that's a little bit crazy. For a lot of people, I realize it doesn't matter that much because you've got some sort of mechanism paying for it, maybe through some sort of scholarship or financial aid or something like that. So you're fine purchasing the book. But I realize a lot of people are purchasing the book out of pocket, and just to pull out $185 on something that, a lot of that information is out there in other places, either via the internet or obviously through this class. It seems a little bit high to me. So what I typically do is the language. So C++ as a language has made some changes over the years, but it's been more like additions. So this course, if you looked at this course, say 10 years ago, sorry, make sure it's muted. If you looked at this course 10 years ago, I'd probably taught it the exact same way, because even though the language has gotten additions, the core fundamentals of the language haven't changed. You just added a couple things, but they're very advanced things that we're not going to really cover in this course. So with that means that I don't really care too much which edition of the book that you have, as long as it's sort of recent. Unfortunately, what the publishers will often do is put out new editions of the book without a whole lot of material additions, and they'll change things around. And it makes it difficult because what will happen is a lot of teachers will be like, okay, well, turn to page 38 and do problems 1 through 5. If I've got a different edition of the book, I can't turn to page 38 because my 38 is different from your 38. So I try to avoid that for the most part. Actually, not for the most part, completely. All of your assignments will be available through Blackboard. So I'm never going to tell you to turn to page 38 and do problems 1 through 5. I will give you the assignment in its entirety in Blackboard. It's completely self-contained. So what that means is that you can get an 8th edition of the book and probably be okay in the course. Okay? It's just the difference between the newest edition and the last edition. I mean, has anybody ever gone out and bought a previous edition of a book? What would you say percentage-wise the discount was? At least half, probably more?
Cost-wise, probably about half or more.
Yeah.
Lower, depending on the book, but content-wise, 5-10% tops.
Yeah, not very much different at all. But just enough that if you had somebody tell you to turn to page 38, your page would be different. So I tried to be understanding. I was a student at 1.2. I know it's very expensive. I know that just from being around IRC, a lot of people pay for your courses either directly or maybe your parents help you out a little bit or you're paying through them loans. You're going to have to pay it back one day. And so if you already got the book, you're welcome to return it to the bookstore. If they hassle you at all, just have them contact me. I'll do my best to help you out. The other thing that the publishers have been doing lately that kind of gets on my nerves a little bit is this access code thing. How many people have had to deal with access codes before? Yeah, kind of frustrating, right? Because it makes it hard to get used books. And so I don't require any sort of access codes or anything. So if you wanted to, you could go out to Amazon right now and get, let's say, the furthest back 7th edition. And I don't know if somebody wants to go on Amazon for me and look up the price of the 7th edition of the book, but I'm guessing it's maybe $20-30. I can't imagine it being much more than that.
I know the price for the 9th edition. I looked it up last night. It's $66.
Oh, on Amazon?
To rent, yeah, just rent the book.
Oh, okay, to rent, okay. So everyone's pretty clear about the book, right? It's not, if you're already having it paid for, it's, for a lot of people, it's whatever. You can just get the book. But if you're at all in a financial situation where you're kind of trying to watch your money, 7th or 8th edition is fine. Really, it's more about being able to refer to the content of the book. And like I said, the way I do the assignments, everything's very self-contained in the book. I'm sorry, it's self-contained in Blackboard to where you're not going to be in a situation where because you had the last edition of the book, you're not going to be able to find the assignment. I'll post everything directly in Blackboard. So standard grading scale. Let's talk about how I grade. So this is a programming class. To me, my measure of how well you did in the course is at the end of the course, how well can you actually write some C++ code? So that, to me, that's the most important thing. So some of these other things like class participation, attendance grades, to me, I realize a lot of you have busy lives. So hopping online to do things like discussion posts and stuff like that, I don't actually particularly care that much about that. I care, do you know how to program? So what I do is typically like 7 or 8 programming assignments and a midterm and final, which are going to be coding. So 100% of your grade in this course will be on writing code. That might be a little bit intimidating, but in practice, most people tend to pass the course. It's usually people that are just, well, I don't want to talk about anybody specific, but in general, the pass rate for the live section of this course tends to be pretty decent. Obviously, there's always different circumstances that'll keep you from passing the course, but if you keep up with the content, if you keep up with the lectures, if you stay on the assignments, if you contact me when you're having trouble, for the most part, those students tend to do okay. One of the things that helps is that the assignments tend to be somewhat like the class examples, and the exams tend to be somewhat like the assignments. So I'm never going to put you in a situation where you're writing code that's like completely foreign. And this morning I had another class, Python. So I had a lot of students in that class that have taken this class before, and I was just kind of did an informal survey. I was just like, out of curiosity, how many people felt like the exams matched the assignments pretty well? And most people raised their hand. Okay, so that's that. So so all of your grade is going to be based on programming, and then your exams are going to be programming exams. One of the reasons that I weight it like this is because Um, for a lot of people, programming classes tend to cause a lot of anxiety and like feelings of that they don't understand it and they're not going to pass the class. And as soon as you start to get it in your head that you're not going to pass a class, there's a lot of research on this that the more anxious you are about the class, the less you're going to understand the material. Does that make sense? So it's like almost like a self-reinforcing thing. You already feel like you're not going to pass the class, and then that means it's even harder to learn, and then you're going to fall even further behind. So I try to really, the thing that tends to give most people anxiety is the exams. So by weighting these exams kind of low, you could still pass the class even if you didn't do well on the exams. It kind of relaxes the course a little bit, and then people get to spend a little bit more time on the assignments. The way the assignments are laid out, typically about every week and a half, 2 weeks, somewhere in that range. So if I did 8 assignments over 16 weeks, you'd think 2 weeks each, but then we have a midterm and final. So in practice, it tends to be more closer to about every week and a half that you have an assignment due. Okay, so that gives you plenty of time to work on it. And historically, I've tried to give you time during class, but that might be a little bit more tough. So what I might try to do, because that's like if we had a full 2.5 hour class, I may try to reserve like 10 or 15 minutes for you to just get started on the assignment. That way you can kind of get a sense of it, and then you'll have to finish it at home. Does that make sense? Because now we're on this hybrid courses where like half's online, half's, so it used to be like in a 2.5 hour class, I could just reserve the whole second half for working on the assignment, but now that's going to be at home. But I'll do my best to try to give you a little bit of time to work on the assignment. This is a very rough scheduled activities. Sometimes I move stuff around. Some of these may take a little bit longer, but this is the general flow for this class, and pretty much almost every programming class is that you start off with these very basic things, and then you get a little bit more advanced, and that's it. Okay, so any questions about the class itself, about books or grading scales or any of the very detailed? Yeah.
When do we need to have the book by?
Whenever. I know that's not a great answer. Maybe 3rd week, 4th week, or something like that. I know some of these sites like Amazon can be a little bit slow, so I want to give you enough time that you can order from them and not feel stressed that, if they tell you your book's going to be here in 2 weeks, you're not freaking out. Does that make sense?
I'm doing enrollment, so I get my books through the school, the high school.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I have to order one from
So I'm confused. Oh, so they're not providing the book this semester, or they're being slow about it?
They are. It's just I don't think they have this specific book in high school, so they have to order it in for me.
Okay. Yeah. A few weeks from now should be all right. To be honest, the first half of the course, one of the things that people actually struggle with is that I give a lot of warnings that this is a difficult course, and then the first half of the course isn't actually that difficult for most people, and then they think, oh, this is actually an easy course, but it's really the second half of the course that's where people start to fall behind. That's why it's not giving a super clear answer, is because as long as you get it within the first few weeks, you should be okay. Okay, so let's talk about the obvious thing that's going to cause a lot of problems for most people is the pandemic. So any questions about the syllabus or anything related to that? So let's briefly talk about coronavirus. I have a feeling it's just going to be this constant thing that we're all going to have to worry about the whole semester. So thank you for everyone in here who was able to remember your masks. I try to bring a couple in case you forget. I think for the most part, I haven't run into anybody who's just like completely anti-mask, because there's online sections of these courses, and I think anybody who really doesn't want a mask, they'll just take the online section of the course. I think for the most part, the few people I've ever run into, they just flat out forgot their mask. It wasn't like anything more than that. But just remember, I'll try to bring a couple masks if I remember them. Now, I realize we're able to keep some sort of reasonable social distancing in here, but I realize that some of you Maybe if there's an outbreak in St. Lucie County, you know, some of you just may not feel comfortable showing up some certain weeks. Maybe your throat's a little itchy and you're like, oh man, should I stay home or go to class? Stay home, okay? I'm recording all these lectures, and one of the things, so let me go through this really quick. So it's a live class, but if you're going to take it at home, the one thing I do ask is most obviously that you have a reliable computer and reliable internet connection. But most people have that. But if you don't, that's a requirement. The access to 2 screens kind of throws people off a little bit. But let me explain that. So what I mean is, when you're taking the course live, what we do is I sit up here, I write some code, I explain that code, and on your computer, you write that code. And you may not even think twice about it, but it's very easy for you to look up your computer, look up, look at your computer, look up. What if you're trying to watch the recorded lecture at home and all you have is a laptop? It's going to be very tough to flip back and forth. You're going to have to minimize and then bring it up, minimize. If you try to tile the screens side by side, that doesn't work terribly well, because then it makes the fonts very small, and the smaller the font is, the more likely you're going to make programming mistakes. So I do ask that you have 2 screens. Now, it turns out for most people this isn't that huge of a deal, because you know how like modern smart TVs, and if you have a Chromecast or anything sort of similar, I think you can even do this with Apple TV, they'll have a YouTube app. Because I'm recording everything through YouTube, all you have to do is go into YouTube and either, I think you can type my name or my email address, just my IRC email address, and then I think the channel pops up. And that makes it so that, say you have a laptop, you can actually work on your laptop while watching it on your TV. Okay, just out of curiosity, how many people have access to that sort of thing, like a smart TV or Chromecast, or usually a pretty good amount of people. The other thing is that you can use dual monitors. How many people have dual monitors at home? Okay. And then other basic things like you need to actually watch the lectures, stay in communication. You have to kind of feel comfortable with the course material. So if like you're completely lost in the class, it's probably not a great idea to, you know, start watching the lectures from home. Now, obviously, there are going to be certain things where you have to stay home. Like I said, like if you're feeling sick, if you show up to class and you test positive, you're wreaking havoc on everybody in this room. Because what happens is once you test positive, if you showed up to class that day when you were positive, everyone in the room is going to have to quarantine, and that screws up their other classes and their jobs. And so if you're feeling sick, just don't chance it. And I realize that's tough because most of the time it's probably not coronavirus. It's something just very simple like allergies or, just the common cold. But unfortunately, we don't have really a way to tell. So, and because COVID-19 symptoms are so generic, it's like fever. Well, fever could be anything. I think the sort of attitude right now is if you have any symptoms, even if it could be something else, you kind of have to just assume that it could be coronavirus. So I would imagine most people in here must be at least somewhat comfortable being in a live classroom because there were online sections of the course, correct? So just out of curiosity, I asked this from one of the morning classes. So you had the option to take online. Just out of curiosity, you can just shout out your answers. Why did you choose to take the live over the online? Any particular reasons?
Better understanding.
Yeah, that's a answer I hear a lot, is that people just, especially for programming, it's just easier to learn live. How many people fall into that category? It's just easier to learn live. Okay. Any other answers? I don't know. Explain.
I was looking up who was teaching different classes and for online in person, yours was the highest. And
Okay.
I was even saying this person is great for when you're just starting out and don't know it very well. So it's like that something me up pretty well.
I gotcha. Okay. Yeah, because I'm not teaching any online section, so I understand that too. Okay. So I'm sort of getting the sense that everyone in the classroom, they feel comfortable showing up to a classroom, or else you wouldn't have signed up for the live section. You have, just to let you know, if you don't feel comfortable, you do have other options. There are online sections that you could probably get into. This is a unique situation. They could probably switch around the courses a little bit, but just be smart. It's one of those things where it's so new. We don't have a lot of exact answers on a lot of things. I can't tell you how many meetings I've sat through and different things I've seen on TV where it's like, this is how it spreads. No, this is how it spreads. And it might go down during the summer. Oh, it could go up. I've just heard so many things. And at this point, I'm just like, whatever your comfort level is and personal responsibility. Just try not to do anything else that could get somebody else sick. And don't put yourself into a situation where you feel like you could get sick. Does that make sense? It's because we don't have a lot of good answers. It's not like something that we've studied for 50 years, like say smallpox or something like that. I'm sure they could find tens of thousands of research papers on exactly how that spreads. And that's a very old disease. I should have come up with a better example, but you get the idea. It's just so new. Anytime I hear information about it on TV, I take it with a grain of salt because some of this stuff you don't really know until it's been around for a few years and you've really been able to study it. So okay, so enough about that. So to give the 30, unfortunately at the beginning of the class I talked too much, but we'll get into some coding. So to summarize, everyone knows how to get a hold of me. The book situation, roughly the grading scale. This is a programming course. We'll go into the details about what code to write and all that sort of stuff. You know that it's recorded. You don't have to show up to class if you don't feel comfortable. Just make those efforts, that I've mentioned to watch the course from home. And more than anything, just stay in communication. The toughest thing, not just for me with all your professors, is that if we can't get a hold of you, it's like maybe I could have worked with you to get you through the rest of the semester, but you're not answering your emails and you're not answering your phone, and then I don't know what else to do. You haven't done any of the course material. I have to give you an F. Does that make sense? But if as soon as you start to fall behind, you email and be like, listen, I was good up until like a week ago, and then this week was just tough. I can work with that, but if I can't get a hold of you for a few weeks, that's much more difficult to work with. Okay, so any questions on any of that? All procedural, administrative stuff. Okay, and all that's in Blackboard, by the way, so if you need to read over the syllabus in more detail, you can. So, okay, now let's get to the interesting stuff, the programming stuff. So this is a course about programming. Now, a couple things before we get started. I always tell people this course is much more like a course on welding or something like that, or like air condition repair, those sorts of types of things, which throws people off because you think, this is like a technology course. I'm going to be doing something very abstract like coding. How could that be different, so much different than or the same than something like air condition repair or welding or something like that? So I always take history. I'm not picking on history, but in a history class, for the most part, you could pass the history class by reading the book, taking some notes, understanding the material, and then doing well on a test. You can't really do that, unfortunately, with programming. There's a base level of concepts, and you can understand things conceptually and still do really terrible, if that makes sense. So if you're learning how to weld, and maybe I shouldn't use this example because I don't know how to weld. I know how to solder. I guess that's the closest thing. So when I was taking a course on how to solder, we got some safety review. We got some base theory on how it works, and essentially you're kind of melting this metal, and then when it cools to room temperature, you've created a joint on the electronics, and so you get a sense of how it works and maybe some techniques and stuff. But just reading a book on soldering, do you think you could pick up an electronics board afterwards and do it, or welding or AC repair just by reading the book? Probably not. What do you have to actually do if you want to become a good welder?
Practice. You
You have to practice. You have to do. Does anybody in here weld? Okay. Would you say that's about the best way to do it is practice? Yeah. Programming is the exact same way. Is that you could read the book, get all the theory, understand things conceptually, and that's probably the biggest trap that I see people fall into, is that you understand the concepts, But that's not enough. You have to be quick with it. You have to have some muscle memory. You have to be able to, just like when you're writing on a piece of paper, you don't think about every single letter. You have this grand thought in your head, and that grand thought translates to maybe a sentence or a paragraph. You're not thinking about every little curve on the paper. Like, you may conceptually understand what every single letter means and what a word means and what a sentence means, but to actually get your thought onto paper, you got to be way, way past that point to where it's just, you're not even thinking about it anymore. One of the best examples I really like to give is multiplication tables, because multiplication tables conceptually are not that tough at all. All you're doing is taking, let's say, 5 times 3, and what are you doing with that? So you're saying 5 3 times. So 5 plus 5 plus 5. Conceptually, that's not tough at all, right? I think most people in here, I could tell you that, and then that's how multiplication tables work, is that it's that number that many times. Imagine if you try to take an algebra class doing that. Be pretty tough, right? Because you'd get some problem where you'd have to do 7 times 8, and then off to the side on your paper, you're like 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8. What do you do instead? You don't go through the whole thing from scratch every time. What do you do somewhere about 3rd grade, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade? What do you have to do with your multiplication tables? Say it again?
You memorize it.
Exactly, you memorize it. Because you need that quickness. It's not just a fact of understanding it. Understanding it's not that tough. You need some working knowledge of it. Programming's the exact same way. Is that a lot of this stuff I'll explain to you, it'll actually seem relatively simple, and it is. It's not enough just to understand the concepts. You have to be able to type it without really thinking about it. Okay? And really the only way to do that is practice. Now, one of the things that I think helps is that I don't do PowerPoints for this class. What I do is I write code examples. And then the idea is that by writing the code examples and then having you also write them, it kind of gives you a little bit of practice in that. Okay, and then every once in a while I'll give you just like an ungraded problem just to take home, and then maybe after then the next class we'll go over it. And then you have an assignment every couple weeks that helps a little bit too. Okay. So that's just how to approach the course. Let's take a step back here. Let's actually go to kind of the history of all this. Sorry, this is one thing. By the way, this is probably one of the few times most of the time we're going to spend coding, but every once in a while I'll bring up Wikipedia. There we go, modern computers. Okay. So you can see this is a very long article, but really the first modern computers start around World War II. Now, they used to have things before that, mechanical computers, and those were really just fancy calculators, and they were like cash registers and things like that. But really, we think about modern computers with this very specific computer here, the ENIAC. Now, this is not stuff you would ever have to know for a test or anything, so don't really worry about writing this down. This is just more to set the tone for the course. So there's this guy, Alan Turing. How many people have heard of this name before, Alan Turing? Okay, so what's the main thing he's famous for, maybe during World War II? Having to do with the Germans. What did he do?
Yeah, he made the machine that deciphered the enigmas.
Exactly, yeah, he broke their encryption. Very brilliant mathematician. And that alone would be enough for a career, but he wasn't done after that. So he wrote this very famous paper. It's on computable numbers. I would never expect anybody to really read it. He was a mathematician, so all this was very theoretical. And in this paper, he essentially made a computer. He was able to prove with a bunch of mathematics that said, okay, here's a general computing device, and it actually turned into something called a universal Turing machine. And he said, okay, if you had this device that had some sort of computation and some instructions and some area to put data, and you put it on this infinite tape, and he does this whole thing. And he said, if you do all these things, anything that can be computed in math can be computed with this device. Well, okay, that's interesting. Well, what are the implications of that? Well, this can do basic things like arithmetic, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. It also means it can do some interesting things like algebra and calculus and trigonometry. And so all of a sudden you've got this very complex calculator. And not just like the simple desk calculators that we use, like this thing could do very, very interesting things. Again, anything that can be computed using formal mathematics could be done with this machine. At that time, post-World War II, all of a sudden, the world gets much more complicated. We've got rockets. All of a sudden, we're dealing with nuclear weapons. We're dealing with the space race, science, mathematics. All these things get very, very, very complicated around this time, post-World War II. Many of these things, especially in engineering, would require a lot of handwritten math. And there was actually an occupation where that's all you'd do all day, is that you'd get maybe a bachelor's degree in mathematics, and then if you didn't want to go for like all the way to a PhD, what you could do is you could get a job, and all you do all day is just calculate things. I think the formal title of the job, I think it actually was called a computer. You just compute things all day. And this guy right here, John von Neumann, I'm sure others as well, but he's pretty instrumental in all this. He saw the implications of this and said, if we can actually make this thing a real machine, we could replace these rooms full of people with a machine that could compute thousands or tens of thousands or million times faster. In practicality, modern computers would probably be trillions of times faster, or maybe even more than that. And so after World War II, he set off to make this thing called the ENIAC, him and a bunch of other people. And actually, kind of as a side note, it doesn't really apply too much to this class. He created something called the von Neumann architecture. Modern computers still to this day, so he created that in the 40s. To this day, modern computers still follow the von Neumann architecture. Very interesting. That some of these decisions that they made very early on with extremely primitive technology. They didn't even have transistors yet. They were doing all these things in vacuum tubes. He was able to create a general computing architecture that still applies today. It applies to mobile phones just as much as servers and desktops and so forth. Anyway, so why do you care about this old computer, this ENIAC? Nobody really, we don't use computers that look anything like this today, outside of maybe that it's the same architecture. During this time is when programming languages started to come about, because when they were doing these programs at the time, we didn't have web applications. We didn't have database-driven applications. We didn't have phone apps. We didn't really have games. The first games were like in the 60s and 70s, and even those tended to be very, very primitive games. And so most of the programming languages at the time tended to be geared toward doing very rudimentary things, like add a couple numbers. If something is equal to another thing, do something. If it's not equal, do something else. Loop over a piece of code very often. And so programming languages themselves tend to be very rudimentary and have very simple instructions. And then the idea is that you take those instructions and you make more and more and more and more complicated things. One of the things that some people get a little frustrated with is that means that we can't just start the course and dive right into making apps. You have to start with these fundamentals. To keep our lives as simple as possible, I try to use examples that are understandable but are also maybe useful. So I tend to like to do a lot of conversions, because that's something a lot of people understand, is like if I want to convert miles to kilometers, I just multiply one number by another. And it turns out we can do some pretty interesting examples with just very, very basic. So it's like the premise is kind of simple, and then we try to do as much with the premise. I don't want you to get confused over the premise. One time I had a programming book on data structures, and the first thing that they tried to do for an example was how to represent integrals using data structures. And I was just thinking, I was like, you could have used a much simpler example and gotten the same concept across. So that's my goal, is to try to use very simple concepts on the programmer writing, and then that way you can focus more on the programming, not what the heck is he talking about. Okay, so that's just kind of the history. A lot of that's interesting. It doesn't really necessarily directly need to be known for the course, but I just don't like to just throw you in and be like, here, we're going to write some programs. I try to give you a sense of some history and why we're writing the types of programs we are, is because it sets the stage now. You're not expecting to write apps. You're not expecting to write games, or I mean, you could write text games. Some students have done that in the past, but you're not going to write like some 3D game or something in this course. You're going to be mostly doing very rudimentary, simple things that over time, it's like a fundamentals course that adds up. One of the interesting things, and it sort of serves as a little bit of a roadblock, is when you go to college and you take a math class, most people typically have had 12 years of math behind them. So if you want to start doing some interesting things with math, it's not like you're starting off day one learning addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, those sorts of things. You have 12 years of math behind you. You go to college. I mean, some people might be able to hop right into a calculus class if they took, got through their algebras and stuff in high school. Programming is not really like that. Very few people actually get any sort of programming class. It's changing a little bit. Did anybody here have a programming class in high school? Usually there's a couple people. For some of you, this might be the class. I realize if you're a dual enroller. But it's very unique. Even if you're a music major, can you enter in college not knowing how to play an instrument and then try to be a music major? No. Computer science is one of those things that's very unique, that you can have no previous programming experience and then hop into the classroom day one and start from scratch. That's one of the things that makes it so tough, is because imagine if you did math like that. If you had no math exposure your whole life, and then all of a sudden your first class is all of a sudden you're trying to do, let's say, algebra, and you're trying to learn a bunch of things all at once. That's kind of unfortunately how it is. It's changing a little bit. They're trying to get some more computer science classes into the schools, but it's a difficult thing to do. I don't know how much they've been able to successfully do it. Okay. So any questions about any of that? That's the history. That kind of sets the stage, kind of puts your mindset into what the course is going to be about. Okay, let's get to the fun stuff. So that's probably the longest speech I give the whole semester. Let's get into the fun stuff and actually writing some code. So hop into Blackboard, and then you'll see under resources. First of all, can everyone still hear me okay? I know it's tough with the mask. I think it muffles me. We're good. And then everyone can see up here okay, correct? So if you go under resources, you'll see this link to C++ REPL. So again, in Blackboard, you go into resources, C++ REPL, and it should open up a new tab. And I'm just going to pull this off to the side so I have a little bit more room to work, and I'm going to clear this out. So when we write code, we're going to write code in something that sort of kind of vaguely looks like English. It's very structured. We'll get to that in a little bit. But computers don't understand English. What do computers understand? Computers know binary. They know ones and zeros. And so at some point, something has to take that code that we've written in this thing that sort of looks like English, and it has to compile. So that's a technical term I'm telling you. It's called compiling. And it takes that code that we've written and it turns it into ones and zeros. It turns it into instructions that the computer can actually understand, because it can't understand the code directly as written. In the real world, you want that compiler plus a lot of other tools that make your life a little bit easier. That's usually called an IDE, an integrated development environment. Now, a very popular IDE is called Visual Studio. It's from Microsoft. Has anybody heard of this software before? Show of hands, anybody heard of it? Has anybody in here installed it ever? How long did it take to install? A little while? Yeah, it's not a small download, and there was probably a lot of questions and options along the way. So So I used to use that software. It is an industry tool. If you ever go out into the real world and start programming, that is one of the tools that you'll probably use. But after several years of teaching this course, far too many people were having problems installing it because it's a large piece of software. If everything works great and you're able to get through everything, it works fine. But as soon as there are problems, it's not an easy thing to troubleshoot. The problems are very unclear, and sometimes I've just had students just never able to solve their problems. Even basic things like finding where it keeps its source code, people have had trouble with. So a few years ago, I discovered this site. It's very, very interesting what they're doing. They not only have it for C++, but for many other languages, is that you can actually write code in your browser, and then, so you'll write the code over here, and then this will be the equivalent of like a command prompt. So notice you're not getting a graphical interface. The things that we're going to work here with are text. Think about in the 1950s and 60s. Did they have keyboards and mice and nice graphics? No. What did they have usually? Just like a text-based screen. And if they were lucky, a keyboard. So that's what we're going to be dealing with. We're going to have our code here, and we can write it over here. It's a very, very useful site. Now, I don't want you to think that you're getting any sort of lesser of experience, because when you're learning the fundamentals, this is fine. Now, maybe if you move on to something more advanced after you finish this course, you might decide to go install Visual Studio. But for this course, we're going to stick with this. I don't want you to think that this is some sort of light version. This compiler here, Clang, and there's another one called GCC, these are professional compilers. So the compiler they're using is a real industry compiler. This compiler right here is what Apple, this is actually from Apple, and they open sourced it. This is actually what they use to compile all their whole operating system and everything. So this is not like a light version of a tool. All they've done is made a website so it's a little bit more user-friendly. This isn't a course on how to install software or how to debug all kinds of weird installation issues or troubleshoot installation issues. This is a class about C++. So this site makes it so that we can actually start writing code, C++ code on day one. So it's very, very, very helpful. So now I'm not going to require this, but what I have noticed in the past is that a lot of students, without me even requesting it, were signing up. And this is a cloud-based service. So first of all, it's free. And when you sign up, and I want to say it's a pretty simple sign-up process. I think just ask for name and email, and that's about it. Password maybe. It makes it so that when you write code in here, you can go to your computer at home, and you don't have to mess around with copying stuff to flash drive or Google Drives or anything like that. It's just available. You just log in. The other nice thing is that I've already mentioned that one of the best ways to learn how to code is to practice. And if you're at a relative's house or a friend's house or at the library, they're probably not going to have a very heavyweight tool like Visual Studio. But they probably do have a web browser and a computer, and so you can just hop on this site and just start writing code. You don't need to download, install anything. So it's a very, very convenient tool. They actually have it for a lot of different languages. I've started using it for almost all my courses because it's just like a way to get started coding day one, which I think is important. But that's what we're going to be using. And the way it works is you write code over here, press this play button, and it runs over here. Okay, so now for the big moment. We're all going to write our first C++ program, or at least first in this class. Some people might have written some other code. Now, I'm going to write, just to kind of warn you, I'm going to write a lot of code up here, and I'm not going to explain what it all means. As an adult, that's kind of a tough thing to hear, because you kind of want to know what everything means. But when you're younger, it's a lot easier. Like if somebody tells you, when you're learning, going back to your multiplication tables, a negative times a negative is a positive. If somebody told you that as an adult, you'd say, that sounds super weird. Explain that to me. Go into it. What do you do as a kid? You're just like, okay. You just memorize it, and that's about the extent of the thinking about it. But as an adult, when you see things you don't understand, it's a little bit more uncomfortable. It's like you see all this stuff in front of you, and I'm just telling you, don't worry about it. But unfortunately, that's going to be the answer, because I've done this class before where I explain everything, and the problem is that people just get confused. And the reality is you don't need to understand everything. You just need to understand the important parts. And then as the semester goes on, I'll explain things as we go on. So there will be many times in this course where I'll write a piece of code, and I'll say, don't worry about this right now. It's because it's just something the language requires, and we're not really ready to discuss it yet because C++ is a real world language. People write very large, high-performing programs in C++. Most game engines, maybe not if the game themselves, but game engines like things like Unity and what's the other one everyone uses, Unreal Engine, those are all written in C++. This web browser that I'm using right here is written in C++. The bulk of the operating system is written in C++. You're probably going to see a lot of code sitting out there on planes and fighter jets and stuff written in C++. So it's a real language. Has anybody seen a language called like Scratch? So Scratch is one of those languages where it's an educational-only language. And it makes it easier to learn, but people don't use it in the real world. C++ is kind of on the other end where it's not super easy to learn, but once you learn it, you're actually learning a language that you could do something important like write a game with it. Make sense? Okay, so with all those warnings, let's go ahead and start coding. So I'm going to write some code here, and then what you do is just write the same code, okay? So now a very quick tip as you're typing this. You'll notice that I'm using a lot of what I'll call funny characters or special characters. Characters you don't use very often, like semicolons. I'm sure in your daily life it's pretty rare you use semicolons, curly braces, these sorts of things. It'll make your life much, much easier if you make the fonts larger. And actually I'm going to go even one larger with my fonts so you really get a sense of the program here. The reason being is because you tend to make a lot of typing mistakes if you can't quite see the code. So I would say at first start off making your fonts very large. For the most part, if you have a laptop, you can do Control plus and minus. That'll make it larger and smaller. Or if you're on a regular computer with a wheel mouse, somebody actually showed me this. I think it's Control, and then you do this, the wheel. It's either Control or the Windows key. I can't remember.
Control.
It's Control. Yeah, and if you just do the wheel mouse, it'll make it larger and smaller. And get it to a point where you can really see all these special characters, curly braces, parentheses, semicolons, angle brackets, some of these characters that you wouldn't normally use. Okay, so everyone's done typing. So if you got what's called a syntax error, if you got a bunch of red text, don't feel bad. I'll help you through that. That means you typed something incorrectly somewhere. Out of curiosity, how many people got it to run correctly and actually said hello world? Show of hands. Okay, so about a quarter, maybe a third. So let me walk you through some very common mistakes. So these are not colons, semicolon. So you don't press the shift key or anything, you just hit the key. So that's a semicolon. These are the curly braces, so not square brackets, not parentheses. It's this guy right here, the curly brace. Every single line of code needs one of these. I shouldn't say every single line. There's certain exceptions, but make sure you have, where I have semicolons, make sure you have that. A lot of people write end one. This is actually end L, end line. Okay, and then run it again for those of you that had errors. Okay, now show of hands how many people have it running. A few more. Okay, so we're in kind of a tricky situation. Usually I like to go around and help people on their computers individually. Because of social distancing, I'm going to attempt to do that, but I'm just going to have to stand very far away from you. So you might have to make your fonts very large. But it's very important that you get through. These are what are known as syntax errors. So it means that the problem with your program isn't that there's some sort of logic issue with it. It's that you just flat out, it doesn't understand what your program is supposed to do. Okay, so show of hands who needs some help with their code that they're getting a bunch of red. Okay. And I usually just work my way back here. So you hit the play button. What happens? Yeah. Oh, there you go. It works. Okay, who's next? On this row? Try just clicking the run button again. Takes a little bit the first time. Okay. And who else in the back? Okay, so everyone's good? Perfect, all right. Give yourself a pat on the back. You wrote your first C++ program. I'd imagine very few people in the world have done that, percentage-wise, I guess. But so, like I said before, I'm not going to necessarily explain everything. So don't worry about this just yet. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about this. Let's just concentrate on line number 7 right here. So in your own words, just give me a summary of what the program did over here. Didn't do much, and there's no really wrong answer. It's not a trick question either. I'm not looking for a very detailed answer. It's very simple. Yeah.
Create the text hello world.
Exactly. It outputted the text hello world to the screen. So what do you think did that? So right here, the C out. This outputted to the screen. I can't remember what the C stands for. I always say copy out. I think that's correct. I'll have to look it up. But anyway, think it outputs to the screen. Okay? What did it output? The stuff between, exactly, the stuff between the double quotes. So this thing between the double quotes, this is what's called a string. We're going to be working very broadly with 2 data types in this course. Strings and numbers. Now numbers, it probably seems pretty obvious, like 10, -3, 7, 0, those sorts of things can be decimal numbers, 3.2. Strings is a little bit more abstract, but once you see a few strings, it'll make sense. A string is a string of characters now. Why do you think we need to differentiate between, so let's do this. Let's write another let me think how I want to do this. Let's take a step back here for a second. Okay, so don't type this, just look up here. So hello world is a string. And I'm telling you that 5 here is a string. Right? And if I run this, this is still a string. Why do you think we need the difference between a number and a string? So the main reason, and most people probably won't, if anybody wants to guess, there don't really know, I'm not going to penalize anybody if you're not quite right. Why do you think we need to separate a string from a number? Because if you notice here, I can write 5 as a string. Remember, anything between the double quotes is a string. And I've written 5 in double quotes as a string. Why do you think we actually want to differentiate between a string and a number?
So we know what's a label, essentially, and what's input data or a function.
Let's see if I can steer you in a different direction. Can I do hello world times 3. Does that really make logical sense? Or let's say hello world plus 3. Does that make sense? Does 5 plus 3 make sense? But if it doesn't know that this is the number 5, it thinks it's the string 5. This plus 3 makes just about as much sense as this plus 3. So we have to have separate numbers, because then we can do arithmetic. We can take those numbers and we can add them together. We can multiply. We can check to see if a number is greater than each other. Okay, so those are going to be the two data types that we're working with, are strings and numbers. How do I tell you it's a number? I just do the number without the double quotes. Okay, so if you just see a number out there just by itself, that means it's a number. If you see things between double quotes, that means that it's a string. We'll get back to these. These are called data types. We'll get back to these later. I just wanted to really understand a string. You kind of have to understand numbers and why we have numbers versus strings. A string is just a blob of a bunch of characters. Some of those characters might be numbers. They might not be characters, but there's a blob of characters. Now, numbers are very specific and unique, because with a number, I might want to add two numbers, multiply them, subtract, divide, those basic operations. So I always get questions on, can I do this in programming or can I do that? One of the great things about programming is, if I try to do something and you quote unquote can't do it, what happens? Is the computer going to all of a sudden shut down and like you're going to have to take it to get repaired? No. All that happens is that either you're going to get a syntax error or the program's going to act kind of funny. So when I hear questions like this, can I do this? My first answer is usually go ahead and try it. Really, one of the best ways, besides practicing, and this is part of practicing, to learn a language is to kind of test its limits and test how the programming language acts. So what I mean by that is, let's go ahead and write another line of code. By the way, so this is a technical term I'm using here. A line of code is that from the beginning of the line all the way until the semicolon. This will make a little bit more sense in a little bit. Oops. I'm going to have to make this a little bit smaller. Is that still okay for everybody? I want it to fit without having to do weird wrapping around the screen. Everyone's still with me, right? I try to tend to go very slow at first, but then I pick it up a little bit as we go along. But there's no point in racing through the examples if people aren't done typing. So that's why I go slow at first. Okay, so I've explained this sort of the C out. Whatever we put to the right of here, it ends up on the screen. I'll explain some of these things more formally later. I try not to use too many technical terms in the beginning because it just becomes confusing. And I already explained what the stuff between the double quotes. What's the technical term? What is this thing between the double quotes called? It starts with an S. A string. I didn't really give you a good sense of what this, and some of you might already know the answer, some of you might have just figured it out. But let's do this. Let's just, from experimentation, try to see what this does. And if I've got something and I want to know what it does, what's the easiest way to find out? Take it away. Get rid of it. Delete it. So let's start off there. Let's get rid of that. And what happens? So I get what's known as a syntax error. By the way, the way you read these is that it says, okay, main.cpp, that's the program we're working on, at line number 7, character number 27. So we go over to line number 7 here. You don't have to actually count out the characters. You'll notice that it gives you a little squiggly. So something must be off here. So there must be some sort of pattern to these guys right here. So maybe I can't just get rid of the end L just by itself. Keep on getting rid of some stuff here. Now, describe to me, again, you don't have to use technical terms, just plain English. What happened here? It ran, but what happened to my output text? Is it on one line or is it on 2 lines? One line. What was it before? 2. So describe to me, what do you think this end L does?
Line break.
Exactly, a line break. Yeah, that's a technical term, but what it does is it, at the end of the line, it's basically the equivalent of hitting the enter key, or if you remember from the old typewriters. Exactly, yeah, so it goes down 1. So again, these are the sorts of things you want to do, is that you take a piece of code and add things, get rid of them, try to break it, okay? Let's do this. Let's go the other direction. So let's add that code back. And we tend to want to do things one at a time. So add back the end L. Make sure it works like you think it does again. Now if I can remove a pair of these, what do you think the next question is? If I can remove a pair, can I add a pair? And I don't really want you to necessarily think too deeply about it. It's just try it. And so now how would you, let me let everyone catch up. So now how would you describe to me, what did the code do? What happened to the output?
Enter twice.
Exactly, yeah, I got 2 line breaks. I got 2 end lines. By the way, that's what that end L is, end line. Does everyone see that? So that's kind of interesting. Let's keep on going with that example. Can I put one in the middle? Can I do this? Let me write something shorter. Do you think I could do that? I followed the pattern. Now it's going to look weird on my screen. You might have to look at it on your own, but it worked out. You see time is, and then it had a line break, and it said 2:53 p.m. So one of the best things you can do is just to get a feel for the syntax of the language is don't just go by what I tell you. You have to kind of experiment with it. If all you ever do is stay within the confines of the things I've told you in this class, you're not going to really get a good sense of the language. You really just got to try things and see what happens. Now we don't really have, because this class is done at 3, right?
Something like that.
Yeah. We have time for one more thing then. Now I already sort of told you that with numbers we can do arithmetic, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. So if I wrote 5 times 3 without running it, so write the code, what do you think the output would be?
15.
Yeah, so let's take a vote. Who thinks it's going to be 15? Who thinks it's going to be 5 star 3? So make your case. So make your case for the second. Who thinks they have a good sense of why?
It must be, there's no second string and not.
Exactly. That's the key word. It's a string. So it's not actually, I can't actually do anything with this. But once it's no longer a string, by the way, for those that haven't seen this before, this is kind of like the calculator syntax where you're using a star to mean multiplication. Let's keep it simple. We'll say plus. I think most people have seen plus before. What this will do is that I'll actually say, okay, I've got a number plus 3 because I don't have the double quotes around it. Now what will line number 10? What will be the output of line number 10?
15.
Sorry, I changed it to plus. Yeah, 8. Do that to you. and whenever it gets around to it, it'll print 8. So you can see this actually can even be used as a simple calculator. So just go through between now and next week, start to get a sense of the language. The first week I try not to do too much A because I have to go through the syllabus and all that other stuff, but this is going to be the general feel for the course, is that we're going to write some code. Usually the code examples will be much more substantial. We'll usually get through about 5 or 6 examples per class. This was just to get a hang of the language a little bit. We'll start to do more interesting things starting next class. But this is just how it's going to be. There's not going to be PowerPoints. There's not going to be a whole lot of formality. It's just going to be me up here writing code examples. We have a little bit of discussion, talk about it a little bit, write some more code. It's much more informal. If that's not for you, I think there's enough time that you can switch out. And then what we usually do is after going through those code examples, I'll give you an assignment that's sort of related to those code examples. And then hopefully there's enough time to at least get started so you can start to work through the problem, okay? So very quickly, I would say you can do 2 things. So you're welcome to sign up, and I think it automatically saves your code. If not, if you hit this little save button right here, you'll notice that it'll create like this kind of funny URL here. This is actually unique. So what it does is it takes 3 dictionary words, and then later on, so you can take this link right here, email it to yourself, and then when you get home, you can actually go back to your code. Okay, so if you don't want, for whatever reason, you don't want to sign up for an account, you can just do that each time. Is that for each code example, you just hit the save button, take this, copy and paste it, email it to yourself, and then when you paste that URL into your address bar at home, you'll get to it. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time. With the last 3 minutes, does anybody have any questions regarding syllabus or anything like that? Yeah.
I saw on the schedule of activities that the assignments, they didn't have a due date.
Is there a schedule of activities on here? Okay. Yeah. So what I usually do is I give the assignments out one at a time, and then I announce the date in class, and then within the assignment itself, I'll put the date. So we're not going to have anything due this week, so don't stress yourself. We'll start having stuff due next week, and then I'll usually try to be pretty clear about the due date. Okay. So any other questions on administrative stuff, or now does anybody have any code questions? Okay. And is this pace comfortable for everyone? Everyone was able to type this fast? Nobody's like super falling behind? Okay, perfect. Okay. So that's pretty much it. We're out of time. If there's no questions, oh, do me one favor. I guess we don't really have time for it today. But when you get home, under assignments, go to attendance. Maybe you'll have time to do it today if you don't have a class after this. We don't have to do attendance each week because I don't really care about attendance, but we have to do it the very first class. And it'll automatically attach your name, so just go to assignments, attendance, and then hit submit. Again, this is a school requirement. We only have to take attendance the first week. And after that, I don't care about attendance ever again. It's just this very first week that we have to take care of this. Almost forgot about that. And then keep an eye on the announcements. What happens is sometimes during class, I completely forget about something important. So maybe between now and next week, check on the announcements. I would say the other thing is don't let a whole week go by without looking at these code examples. So maybe sometime this weekend, if you have a little bit of time, even though you don't have a formal assignment, just go in and try to redo the code examples that we did today. Make sure you get a good sense of C out. Try to experiment a little bit with the end line and so forth, okay? Okay, any questions? Last chance? Okay, all right, good luck with the other classes. Stay safe, and I'll see everybody next week.